It was February 1958. The winter that year had come down on New York City like something personal. Snow packed the gutters of 125th Street into gray walls of ice. The elevated train on 8th Avenue threw sparks into the frozen dark as it rattled northward. Steam rose from the sidewalk grates on Lenox Avenue the way it always did. That particular exhale of the city's underground heat meeting the bitter above-ground air. And Harlem streets, normally alive at almost any hour, had thinned to the essential. The night shift workers, the numbers runners doing their last rounds, the men standing in the doorways of corner bars nursing the end of something. It was the kind of cold that made even the dangerous cautious. And on a side street 3 blocks from the corner of 118th and 7th Avenue, in the dim vestibule of a building where 2 women had just exited from a dinner gathering, a man with a knife made the decision that would, within hours, set in motion one of the most methodical, comprehensive, and, in its own terrifying way, bloodless acts of organized retaliation that Harlem had ever witnessed. The woman he attacked was Mayme Hatcher Johnson, the wife of Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man the city called Bumpy. The knife found her left arm, just below the shoulder. It was a stabbing meant to intimidate, not to kill, a warning sent to a specific address, through a specific body. But the man who delivered it had made a miscalculation so profound, so catastrophically ignorant of the landscape he was operating in, that experienced men who heard about it later reportedly refused to believe it had happened the way it was described. Because in 1958, in Harlem, in the world Bumpy Johnson had spent 25 years constructing with discipline, patience, and occasional ferocity. You did not touch his wife. You did not even look at his wife with intention. The people who understood the rules knew this the way they knew not to look directly at the sun. The man with the knife had not learned the rules. He would learn them by morning, and so would every single one of his associates. By the time the sun came up over the East River and the light fell cold and thin across Upper Manhattan's rooftops, something extraordinary had happened. Not a war, not a massacre, something quieter and, in many ways, more frightening than either. The men connected to the attack, 11 individuals whose names, residences, and routines were fully documented in the intelligence network Bumpy had maintained for decades, had simply ceased to be present in New York City. Not dead, not arrested, not hospitalized, gone. And that, if you understand anything about how power actually works in a city like New York in the 1950s, is the detail that should make you stop and think. Because it means something very specific. It means someone made 11 separate phone calls, or visits, or messages, and whatever was said, whatever was communicated, was so clear, so credible, and so immediate that 11 grown men, some of them hardened criminals with their own violent histories, decided in the space of a single night that the correct response was to vanish. This is the story of that night. But to understand it completely, to understand how Bumpy Johnson built something capable of producing that kind of response, you need to go back. Back to the wars that made him. Back to the alliances that sustained him. Back to the woman at the center of it all. And to the men who, through ignorance or arrogance or both, put their hands on what was not theirs to touch. Settle in, because this story is going to take you places that the history books were too polished to visit. To understand why 11 men disappeared in a single night in February 1958, you need to understand what Bumpy Johnson was by that point in his life, not just as a street figure, but as a structural force in one of the most complex urban environments in the world. New York City in the 1950s was, in organizational terms, a layered system of competing and cooperating power structures. The 5 Italian-American crime families, Luciano, Mangano, Profaci, Gagliano, and Bonanno, had divided the city's illegal economy among themselves in a series of agreements brokered in the late 1930s and formalized through the National Crime Syndicate. They controlled waterfront operations, construction, garbage collection, loan sharking in certain markets, gambling, and others. Their influence extended into law enforcement, city government, and the justice system through decades of patient relationship building and systematic bribery. And then there was Harlem. Harlem was, in the organized crime geography of New York, its own distinct territory, one that the Italian families controlled in name but could never truly dominate in practice. The reason was demographics and economics. Harlem's informal economy, centered primarily on the numbers game, but extending into protection arrangements, nightclub ownership, and various other hustles, was embedded in the community in a way that outside operators simply could not replicate. You needed runners who were trusted on specific blocks. You needed collectors who knew specific families. You needed dispute resolution mechanisms that the community would accept. None of that could be imported from Mulberry Street or Canarsie, which is why, since his ascent in the late 1930s, Bumpy Johnson had maintained a particular kind of relationship with the Italian families, close enough for mutual protection, far enough for genuine autonomy. He paid tribute. A percentage of Harlem's numbers revenue flowed to whichever mafia family held a nominal overlordship of Upper Manhattan's territory. But in exchange, he ran his operation his way, made his own decisions, and was recognized in the informal governance structure of New York organized crime as the legitimate authority above 110th Street. By 1958, this arrangement had been in place for nearly 20 years. Bumpy was 52 years old. He had served time at Alcatraz between 1951 and 1954 on federal narcotics conspiracy charges, a stretch that had tested both his health and his organizational control. His network had been managed in his absence by a combination of loyal lieutenants and, quietly and effectively, by Mayme herself. When he came back in 1954, the operation had not only survived but grown. That durability was a statement. It told rivals, allies, and law enforcement alike that Bumpy Johnson's organization was not built around a single man's physical presence. It was built around systems, loyalties, and an earned reputation that functioned even when he was behind federal walls. The men who reported to Bumpy in 1958 were not, as a group, the most violent men in New York. Violence was a tool, expensive, messy, and consequential, that a mature operation deployed sparingly. What they were, collectively, was a remarkably effective information gathering and decision executing network. They knew who was operating in Harlem at any given time. They knew which outside actors had legitimate business in the community and which were trespassers. They knew, in most cases, exactly who was responsible for specific incidents before any formal investigation had even begun. This intelligence function was the true foundation of Bumpy's power. By the time an adversary understood that they had attracted his attention, he already knew far more about them than they knew about themselves. It was also, in 1958, the reason why what happened to the men who attacked Mayme was not chaotic or improvised. It was the activation of a system that was always, in some sense, already running. The question is, who were those men? And why did they do it? The attack on Mayme Johnson in February 1958 was not random. This is the first, most important thing to understand about it. Mayme was not a woman who found herself in dangerous situations by accident. She moved through Harlem with awareness, and, when she went outside her immediate community, with a specific kind of caution that years of being Bumpy Johnson's wife had made second nature. She knew which neighborhoods were safe. She knew which faces to trust. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, the protocols of surviving in proximity to organized power. The attack was a message. It came from a man named Vincent Caruso, or rather, from the operation Caruso represented. Caruso was a mid-level operator connected loosely to the Profaci crime family, working a territory that butted up against Harlem's southern edge in the upper 90s and low 100s, in the borderland neighborhoods where the transition from Italian-American East Harlem into the Black Harlem of 110th Street and above had been shifting steadily northward for 2 decades. Caruso was not a made man. He was an associate, a fringe figure with aspirations and a set of ambitions that were, in the estimation of more experienced men around him, badly calibrated to his actual standing. He had, over the preceding 6 months, been making tentative moves to expand his operation into Harlem proper. Small things, initially. A numbers runner who suddenly had a new silent partner he hadn't chosen, a club owner who found his protection arrangement renegotiated by men he didn't recognize. These are test borings, each one probing how Bumpy would respond, how quickly, and with what force. Bumpy's response had been, until this point, measured and indirect. He did not respond with violence. He responded by making the renegotiated arrangements collapse, the new silent partner disappear back to wherever he came from, and the club owner quietly informed that his situation had been corrected. No confrontation, no declaration of war, just the quiet reassertion of existing reality. But Caruso, critically, misread the restraint as weakness. This is a mistake that people in Bumpy's orbit made with remarkable regularity across his career, and it always ended the same way. Bumpy's restraint was never weakness. It was the confidence of a man who knew that his power was sufficiently established that he did not need to prove it. He responded minimally because minimal responses were sufficient. The moment they ceased to be sufficient, his response would scale. Caruso, having misread the situation, decided to escalate. The attack on Mayme was, by all accounts pieced together from later testimony and community documentation, orchestrated as a deliberate provocation, an attempt to demonstrate to the broader criminal community that Bumpy Johnson's reach and authority were limited, that he could be touched, that the territory he considered his was genuinely contestable. The logic, such as it was, held that if Bumpy responded with the kind of open, violent retaliation that a direct attack on his wife would seem to demand, he would expose himself to federal scrutiny, break his agreements with the mafia families who preferred stability, and potentially trigger a conflict that would weaken his position even if he won it. It was on paper a calculated gamble. In practice, it was built on a foundational misunderstanding of who Bumpy Johnson was. Caruso was also, at 34, a man who had come up in the criminal world after Bumpy's reputation had already calcified into legend. He had heard the stories, but had not experienced the reality. He knew, abstractly, that Bumpy was feared. He did not know, viscerally, what that fear was based on, what specific events, what specific demonstrations of controlled power had created it across 2.5 decades of operation. He knew the name. He did not know the history. That night, in the vestibule on 118th Street, one of Caruso's men, a 26-year-old named Frank DeLuca, described in community accounts as Caruso's most aggressive and least thoughtful lieutenant, was the one who actually made the move. Mayme was accompanied by a friend, a woman named Dorothy who worked at a community center on 121st Street. The confrontation was brief. DeLuca said something. The exact words are not on record, and when Mayme responded, he produced a knife. The wound was real. Mayme was taken to Harlem Hospital, treated, and discharged the same night. The wound was not life-threatening. DeLuca had apparently been instructed to mark, not to kill. But Bumpy Johnson did not receive the news with the distinction between marking and killing that Caruso had intended. He received it as a violation of everything he had spent 25 years protecting. And he was not angry. This is the detail that people who were in the room that night later described most often when they talked about it. He was not shouting. He was not throwing things. He sat in a chair in the kitchen of his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, and he listened to the full account. And then he sat in silence for what one witness described as approximately 2 full minutes. And then he said, very quietly, to the men in the room, "I need the complete picture. Everyone connected. Everyone." By 10 p.m., he had it. What happened in the 4 hours between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. on that February night is the operational heart of this story. And it is in many ways the clearest demonstration of what made Bumpy Johnson different from every other power figure in Harlem before or after him. He didn't react. He mapped. The surveyor, the intelligence operative whose identity has never been publicly confirmed, but whose role in Bumpy's network is documented in multiple oral history accounts, arrived at Edgecombe Avenue within 40 minutes of being contacted. He brought with him a mental file on Caruso's operation that was, by multiple accounts, startlingly comprehensive. 11 names, 11 addresses, their known routines, their family situations, their individual financial entanglements, their weaknesses, both the ones they knew about and the ones they had apparently been unaware of. This level of detail on a rival operation raises an obvious question. Had Bumpy been tracking Caruso before the attack? The answer, based on available oral history, is yes, but not because he had anticipated this specific event. He tracked everyone who moved in or near Harlem. He tracked them the way a city government tracks building permits. Not because every permit is a crisis, but because the information is necessary for governance, and because the cost of not having it, when you finally need it, is catastrophic. He had been accumulating intelligence on Caruso's operation for months, since the first tentative probes into Harlem's numbers territory. By the night of the attack, the file was current, complete, and ready to act upon. What Bumpy did with it was characteristically not what anyone watching expected. He summoned 3 men, not enforcers, not the muscle his reputation suggested, but 3 men who were, in different ways, intermediaries. Men who could move between worlds without triggering the alarm systems that direct action would have set off. The first was a man known in Harlem as the Deacon, a church-going, respectable-seeming figure who also happened to have relationships with senior members of at least 2 Italian crime families, accumulated over decades of community interface. The Deacon's role was to make a specific communication to a specific person in the Profaci family. That Bumpy was aware of the attack's connection to a Profaci-adjacent associate, that he was handling it himself, and that any attempt by Profaci loyalists to intervene on Caruso's behalf would be taken as Profaci's endorsement of the attack on Mayme Johnson. This message was extraordinarily sophisticated. It did 2 things simultaneously. First, it informed the Profaci family that they had a liability, a loose associate who had taken an unauthorized action that could blow back on them. Second, it effectively neutralized any possibility of Profaci support for Caruso, because accepting that support would mean accepting responsibility for what Caruso had done. The Deacon delivered the message. The response from the Profaci contact, by later account, was immediate and unambiguous. Caruso was on his own. The second intermediary was a man whose name appears in various Harlem oral histories simply as Ernesto, a Puerto Rican community figure with deep roots in East Harlem who had maintained relationships with both the Black Harlem Network and various actors in the neighboring Italian-American and Latino communities. Ernesto's role was more delicate. He was to make individual contact with 3 of the 11 men on the list who had the weakest ties to Caruso's operation, men who were peripheral associates, not core members, and convey a message that was simultaneously an offer and a deadline. The message, as reconstructed from later accounts, was essentially this: you know what happened tonight. You are being given the opportunity to not be part of what happens next. The opportunity expires at sunrise. 3 of the 11 men took the offer. They left New York that night, making their own arrangements without Bumpy having to do anything to them directly. They simply chose, correctly, to be somewhere else. The third intermediary was perhaps the most surprising, a lawyer. Not a mob lawyer, a legitimate civil attorney with offices on 125th Street who had long-standing relationships with both Bumpy Johnson's legitimate business interests and, by separate paths, with multiple figures in law enforcement and city government. This man's role was to make a series of phone calls to people in positions of official authority. The nature of those calls has never been fully documented. That resulted in 3 of the remaining 8 men on Bumpy's list suddenly finding themselves subjects of overdue law enforcement attention that had nothing to do with Mayme Johnson and everything to do with outstanding matters in their own legal histories. By 1 a.m., 3 men had been picked up by police on various charges. 3 had voluntarily evacuated the city. 5 remained, the core of Caruso's operation, including Caruso himself and Frank DeLuca, the man who had held the knife. It was for these 5 that the third phase of the operation was reserved. In this phase, unlike the first 2, which had operated entirely through intermediaries and legal mechanics, was direct. There is a particular kind of fear that is different from ordinary fear. Ordinary fear is about pain, about physical harm, about the immediate consequence of being in the wrong place with the wrong people. Ordinary fear is loud. It comes with raised voices and visible weapons and the adrenaline of an obvious threat. The fear that Bumpy Johnson's direct attention produced was different in kind. It was quiet. It was precise. And it was terrifying specifically because it communicated without any flourish or theater that the person experiencing it had already lost, that the conversation they were having was non-negotiation but a notification. By 2 a.m. on February night in 1958, 5 men received visits, not from an army. In each case, by accounts that filtered through Harlem's oral tradition over the following years, it was a small group, 2 or 3 men, in some cases just 1. Men who were known, respected, and understood. Men whose presence at your door at 2 a.m. meant something very specific about who had sent them. What was said in each of those conversations has never been fully documented. The men who received the visits did not, in subsequent years, give detailed accounts of them, which is itself a form of communication. Silence about a specific event, in the circles these men moved in, meant that the event carried a weight that made speaking about it feel inadvisable even years later. What is known, from Harlem oral history and from the observable facts of what happened afterward, is this. Frank DeLuca, the man who had held the knife, left New York by private car before 5 a.m. He did not return for 11 years. When he did, he was not involved in any criminal activity. He ran a small automotive repair shop in New Jersey and, by all accounts, lived with a particular quietness that people who knew his earlier self found remarkable. Vincent Caruso made a phone call, sometime between 2 and 4 a.m., to his senior contact in the Profaci family, apparently still hoping for intervention. The response he received was, by all accounts, brief. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. After it ended, Caruso made his own arrangements to leave the city. He was gone before sunrise. The remaining 3 core associates followed within hours, not because they were directly visited, but because the news of what had happened to Caruso and DeLuca traveled through the network faster than any messenger could have carried it. By 7 a.m., when the winter sun came up pale and thin over Upper Manhattan's rooftops, all 11 men were gone from New York City. 3 in police custody, 3 having taken the offered exit, 5 having received direct communication from Bumpy's network. Not one of them dead, not one of them in a hospital. Gone, the territory they had been attempting to enter, the numbers operations they had been probing, the protection arrangements they had been testing, reverted immediately and completely to Bumpy's operation. No vacuum, no transition period, no contested aftermath. The space that Caruso had been trying to occupy simply closed, like water filling around a removed stone. Harlem noticed, not in the newspapers. This was not a story that found its way to print, and the absence of bodies meant there was nothing obvious for journalists to report. But in the bars and barbershops, in the conversations between community figures who tracked these things, in the quiet assessments of men who operated in Harlem's informal economy, the word moved with a precision and speed that mirrored the operation itself. Bumpy had been touched. Bumpy had responded, and the response had been total, immediate, and essentially invisible from the outside. The message was heard by everyone who needed to hear it, and by no one who didn't. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who finds the real history of power, race, and organized crime more fascinating than any fiction, subscribe to this channel right now. We go deep on these stories every single week, in ways that no documentary or textbook has ever quite managed. turn on notifications, and come back. The best episodes are the ones you don't know are coming. Here is something that almost every account of this incident gets wrong, by omission. Mayme Johnson was not a passive victim in this story. She was a participant, not in the violence, not in the planning of the retaliation, or at least not in its tactical details, but in the sense that matters most, the sense of understanding, intelligence, and deliberate decision-making that shaped how the entire situation was managed. Mayme Hatcher Johnson had been living in proximity to organized criminal power since the early 1940s. She had managed Bumpy's community relationships through his Alcatraz stretch. She had maintained a network of community trust that was, in its own way, as valuable to Bumpy's operation as any enforcement capability. She understood, with a clarity that most outsiders never achieved, how the system worked, what it was for, and where its limits were. When she came home from Harlem Hospital on the night of February, arm bandaged, face composed, she sat with Bumpy for approximately 20 minutes before anyone else was admitted to the apartment. What was said in those 20 minutes is not on any record, but by multiple accounts from people who interacted with Bumpy in the hours immediately following, he came out of that conversation with a level of specific detail about the context and purpose of the attack, who had ordered it, what it was intended to communicate, and why it had targeted Mayme specifically. That went beyond what a frightened victim of a random assault would have provided. Mayme had been paying attention long before the knife appeared. She had noticed things, specific incidents, specific patterns, that she had apparently been filing away without alarming Bumpy unnecessarily. In those 20 minutes, she briefed him, and the briefing was good enough to direct the evening's subsequent operations with remarkable precision. This is an aspect of Mayme Johnson's role in Bumpy's world that has consistently been underexamined, perhaps because it doesn't fit comfortably into either the gangster's passive wife narrative or the separate and equally reductive criminal queen narrative. Mayme was neither. She was a partner, an informed, intelligent, strategically aware partner who chose the role she played with full knowledge of its costs and boundaries. She did not run the streets, but she understood them, and on the night that someone tried to use her body as a message to her husband, she made sure that message was answered in full. Her own account of the night, given in fragments to community historians in the 1970s and 1980s, is careful and selective. She confirmed the attack. She confirmed speaking with Bumpy afterward. When asked what she told him, she paused for a long moment and then said, "I told him what I'd seen and what I thought it meant." He asked good questions. He always asked good questions. The simplicity of that description is almost jarring against the complexity of what followed. But perhaps that's the point. The most effective kinds of intelligence, the information that actually changes outcomes, is often not dramatic. It's accurate. Mayme Johnson, in 20 minutes, gave her husband enough to act on with precision rather than emotion. And precision, in the criminal world as in most others, is what separates outcomes from disasters. What happened in the following hours was, in some fundamental sense, her operation as much as his. The winter of 1958 passed. Spring came. Harlem breathed. Vincent Caruso never meaningfully returned to New York's criminal world. He appears in subsequent records as a minor figure in a Philadelphia-adjacent operation that never grew beyond the small time. The ambition that had driven him toward Harlem, toward the tested of Bumpy Johnson's authority, apparently did not survive the February night that answered it. Frank DeLuca spent a decade in New Jersey, working the automotive shop, reportedly becoming, in the words of one person who encountered him in the mid-1960s, a completely different kind of man, quieter, more measured, with an observable and permanent awareness of consequences that seemed to inform every decision he made. The three men taken into police custody served various short sentences on the charges that had been activated against them. They reemerged into civilian life at separate intervals and, by all available evidence, did not return to organized criminal activity. The three who had taken the offered exit scattered, one to Chicago, one to Miami, one, reportedly as far as Los Angeles, and built lives that were, by design, below any threshold of visibility that would attract the attention of anyone in New York. Bumpy Johnson never made a public statement about any of it. He never acknowledged the incident to journalists or law enforcement. He conducted himself, in the weeks and months following February 1958, with the same composed, deliberate public presence that characterized his entire post-Alcatraz operation. He was seen at community events. He was seen at restaurants. He was generous with his time for people who needed his help, cautious with his words around everyone else. He was, in the language of his world, untouchable, not because nothing could reach him, but because enough people now understood, with sufficient specificity, what reaching for him actually cost. The Italian crime families, for their part, drew a quiet institutional lesson from the Caruso episode. The Profaci family's decision to decline support for Caruso, made within hours of the deacon's message, was by itself a significant recalibration of how Bumpy Johnson's territory was understood within the broader organized crime geography of New York. Prior to February 1958, there had been occasional internal discussions within the families about whether the arrangement with Harlem's black operators could be renegotiated under more favorable terms. After February 1958, those discussions appear to have quieted considerably. Bumpy Johnson had, without firing a shot or generating a single newspaper headline, demonstrated something important: that his network was fast enough, precise enough, and institutionally connected enough to resolve a major challenge within a single working night. The operational efficiency was its own argument. For Harlem itself, the episode became part of the oral tradition that accumulated around Bumpy Johnson's name during his lifetime. One of many stories that circulated through barbershops and community gatherings as evidence of something that the community both needed and found uncomfortable: the existence of a figure who, for all his criminal activities, functioned as a genuine protector of the neighborhood and its people. This duality, predator and protector, criminal and community anchor, is the source of the lasting fascination with Bumpy Johnson's legacy. He cannot be simply lionized because his operation exploited the same community it protected. He cannot be simply condemned because the protection was real and the community that received it had been systematically abandoned by every formal institution that should have provided it. He was, as he had always been, the answer to a question that shouldn't have needed asking. Mayme Johnson lived until 2009, 41 years after her husband's death. In those 4 decades, she became something that Bumpy never fully was during his lifetime: publicly respected. She worked in community advocacy. She supported prison reform efforts. She participated in the preservation of Harlem's history, giving carefully measured accounts of the life she had lived and the man she had loved, always insisting on complexity and always resisting simplification. When asked about February 1958, about the knife, the wound, what came after, she responded the way she responded to most sensitive questions about Bumpy's operations, with a measured acknowledgement followed by a kind of principled reticence that communicated more than disclosure would have. Ellsworth understood, she said, in one late-in-life interview, that the worst thing you could do to a man who hurts your family is to let him see that the family is still standing, still whole, still unafraid. That philosophy, the demonstration of continuity as the ultimate response to disruption, was in retrospect the organizing principle of Bumpy Johnson's entire approach to power. He did not want people afraid of him in the simple sense of fearing physical harm. He wanted them to understand something more profound: that the world he had built was durable, that challenges to it would fail not through overwhelming force, but through the quiet, comprehensive activation of everything he had spent decades constructing. He wanted adversaries to understand, and the distinction Mayme had articulated years earlier about the Klan incident applied equally here: not merely punished, but educated. The education, in February 1958, was complete by sunrise. 11 men gone, 1 woman standing, 1 territory intact, one reputation so thoroughly reinforced that it would sustain itself for the remainder of Bumpy Johnson's decade of life. And no one who mattered in any of the worlds Bumpy operated in misunderstood what had happened or what it meant. In a lexicon of organized power, where actions are messages and silence is speech, and the most significant events are often the ones that leave no formal record, February 1958 in Harlem was a masterwork. Not because of what was destroyed, because of what was preserved. Bumpy Johnson died in July 1968 at Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street, at the table where he had eaten hundreds of meals in the company of friends and associates and ordinary Harlem residents who just wanted to share space with the man who, for better and worse, had made their neighborhood his life's work. Heart failure. He was 62. The city that had tried to contain him, arrest him, exile him, and outlast him couldn't quite manage it while he was alive. In death, it couldn't quite forget him either. Harlem remembered. Harlem still does. Because when the institutions that are supposed to protect you don't, when the systems fail and the formal authorities look away and the cold comes down hard and the knife finds someone it shouldn't have found, the question isn't whether someone will respond. The question is whether the response will be worthy of the wound. In February 1958, it was. By sunrise, all their men were gone, and Harlem was still standing.